I refer to the decision by Benny Gantz to leave Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet, something which had been anticipated, rumoured, expected, desired for quite some time and in many, many quarters, but something which has now finally happened. Noga Tarnopolsky has been steering us through some of the vicissitudes of Israeli politics now for some months, and she joins me now from Jerusalem. How expected was this, Noga, and what does it mean?
Hello.
Hello.
It was very expected. In fact, it had been announced for the evening previous, for Saturday night, but it was postponed due to the hostages release. And it's been also called for by a very large public at this point for months. And the impact is difficult to gauge this early on. But what I think people should know is that while Benny Gantz and his party never actually joined the coalition, never joined the government, they were only part of the war cabinet. So this doesn't change the parliamentary balance for Netanyahu, which remains a narrow majority, but it could cause a lot of upheaval indirectly, because whereas Gantz and his partners' voices were very powerful voices for, let's say, moderation and conventional politics, now they're gone. And I think it's very possible that the first thing we'll see is a sharp, radical right-wing turn by Netanyahu's government.
Which would, I mean, in a sense, it makes Gantz's decision more confusing, because he was acting as you describe it, he was acting as a sort of salve, as a brake upon the lurch towards the Smotrich.
Well, it's not. Sorry, forgive me.
No, you carry on.
I just meant it is confusing if you look at it that way, but I think he couldn't really be asked to commit political suicide by remaining in a government in which he gave the speech of a lifetime yesterday. He accused Netanyahu of torpedoing the aims of the war. I mean, really a historic speech to accuse the prime minister of that. He accused the prime minister of defeating almost all efforts to get the hostages back. So if that's how he feels, I think it would be almost an impossible ask to expect him to stay in a government and therefore carry some of the blame of what the government's doing when he feels he's not having impact.
To your point about Gantz's allegation that Netanyahu, I mean, 4 hostages were released this weekend, of course, and reports out of Gaza that 274 Palestinians, including at least 64 children, were killed in the same time period. But that point there about the accusation that Netanyahu's not done enough or much to get the hostages freed, does that tally with reports that America is now entering into almost unilateral negotiations with Hamas to get Israeli hostages freed in a conversation that Israel won't even be part of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm chuckling. The subject is obviously not funny. It's a matter of life or death.
It's a wry chuckle, Noga.
But it's a wry chuckle because I'll tell you what I think is happening. Netanyahu, yesterday, with Gantz's departure, Netanyahu already began to adopt a much more extremist kind of form of language, stepping away, as it were, from the proposal to Hamas, which Joe Biden presented a week ago and said that this was Israel's proposal. Israel had agreed to it. And so now, of course, Hamas has not said yes or no. Hamas is keeping the whole world dangling. And that has to be said. But Netanyahu appears to be trying to step away from it. And my best guess, it's hard for me to imagine that the White House would truly engage in unilateral negotiation to release its, let's say, American hostages and no other hostages. But it is very easy for me to believe that the White House would like Prime Minister Netanyahu to believe that they're contemplating this. And that's what we're, I think, led to understand, so that Netanyahu, as he considers his next steps, will have to take into account the possibility that the White House will make it evident that it is possible to release hostages if he only wanted to. Now, in terms of the very spectacular hostage release military operation that you mentioned, I think I am absolutely certain that many people were killed, but I do think we have to be very careful with Hamas's figures, which time and again have been used by almost all media, because since we have no other access, we have no access to Gaza, and the Israeli media keeps all journalists out of Gaza. What they're doing is giving Hamas the last word. But I still think we have to be careful with those figures.
Absolutely. And we must, I should also stress, rescued, not released, rescued. I mean, it was a raid designed to get them out. And speaking of media coverage, I've become quite a big fan of your Twitter feed, Noga.
Thank you.
Well, in which you most recently point out that Israel is letting Russia Today into Gaza, but not letting in the BBC, CNN, Sky News, Channel 4, ITV. That took
or
me,
myself,
or you even. Much more importantly,
times.
or you. That somewhat took me by surprise.
Listen, it's absolutely shocking. There's a feeling, that in Israel, that simply, it's not a feeling. There's a reality that really no one is in charge of media messaging. It is a disaster. And the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces spokesperson, by the way, who took up his job weeks before the attacks of October 7th and was a celebrated Navy SEAL but had zero media experience when he took up this job, they decide basically on the basis of personal preference who will get into Gaza and who won't. And it is them who have made this decision that basically we will only hear out of Hamas. We will only hear from Hamas from Gaza because they don't release their own figures. I'm not sure they're obliged to, but they don't, and they don't let any of us in. And so from the Israeli point, if we're looking at it from the point of view of Israeli government messaging, this policy has been a catastrophe. And yes, it turns out that a guy who works for RT is palsy with people in the IDF spokesperson's office, and he got in, whereas much more serious media outlets have not.
Finally, Noga, I don't know if you can speak about Israeli public opinion as if it's a sort of homogenous phenomenon, but how is all this playing with, from Benny Gantz to the rescue of the hostages through to the increasing alienation from the international community in general, or America in particular? I mean, where is public feeling now on the ground in Israel?
Well, in terms of international isolation, as you know, Secretary of State Blinken is about to land in Israel.
Yes.
I think that the correct perception of Israel as growingly isolated is reported a bit differently in Israel, and so Israelis are much more confused about what's going on. But in terms of public opinion, something fascinating has happened, which is that when the hostages were released on Saturday to great jubilation, there was an immediate assumption, even on my part, that this could give Prime Minister Netanyahu a boost. It was one of these very rare moments of joy in a terrible period. And it has not happened in part because the released hostages, in their initial statements to their own family members, said that the protests, that they were able to see the anti-government, the pro-hostage release protests when they were in captivity in Gaza. They saw them on Al Jazeera. And so they said that this gave them strength and this gave them hope. And so instead of this spectacular release being used, somehow turning into a sense of support for Netanyahu, it seems conversely to have given some fuel to the protest movement against him.
What a tangled web we weave. Eh?
Yep.
Noga, thank you. As always, Noga Tarnopolsky there, who you can follow on Twitter and whose dispatches from Jerusalem have become incredibly valuable to us, trying to make sense, as we say, of what is happening there. And, of course, up to and including the confusion about how what we are having reported here, whether it is the numbers that we rely upon for casualties and deaths, or whether it is the perception of international isolation, the story on the ground in Israel could be quite different. There is, if you like, wiggle room on almost all of this.